And validation is a thief that does not wear a mask. It wears the faces of your friends, your family, and the strangers who applaud you before you have even stepped onto the stage. We are biologically wired to seek approval and to hunt for the nodding heads and the widened eyes of impressed peers. But there is a fatal error in this mechanism, and a glitch in the human software that destroys greatness before it can breathe. When you announce your plans, when you vividly describe the castle you intend to build, and your brain releases a premature flood of dopamine. It tricks you into feeling the satisfaction of the achievement without having endured the agony of the labor. And you become a psychological addict, high on the fumes of a victory that hasn't happened yet, leaving you with no fuel for the actual war. And the tavern known as the Hollow Barrel smelled of damp wool, roasted garlic, and the copper tang of cheap ale. And it was a place where shadows clung to the corners and men came to boast of lives they were not living. In the center of the room, and bathed in the flickering orange glow of a tallow candle, sat Julian Vane. Julian was not a king, nor a soldier, nor a wealthy merchant. He was a clockmaker, or rather, and he told people he was the architect of time itself. He was handsome in a ragged, artistic sort of way, and with ink-stained fingers and a scarf that he draped dramatically over his shoulder. Tonight, like every night for the past 6 months, he was holding court, and it will not just tell the hour, Julian announced, his voice a rich baritone that cut through the murmur of the crowd. He gestured with a half-eaten turkey leg and painting shapes in the smoky air. Standard clocks are prisons. They trap you in the rigidity of seconds and minutes. My creation, the Chronos Aeterna, will breathe, and it will track the phases of the moon, the tides of the salt sea, and the specific alignment of the constellations relative to the observer's heartbeat, and it relies on a fluid gear mechanism using mercury and weighted glass. It is revolutionary. A collective gasp went around the table. A young barmaid leaned in, and her eyes shining with adoration. Mercury and glass. Julian, that sounds imponderous. That sounds impossible. Julian leaned back, soaking in the warmth of her gaze, and it felt better than the whiskey. It felt like a warm bath on a winter day. Genius is always impossible until it is done, my dear, and I have the schematics locked away in my mind. The casing will be carved from petrified oak, wood that has not seen the sun for 1,000 years. It will hum, a low and resonant hum that calms the nervous system. To Julian, a man at the end of the table shouted, raising a tankard. To the master of time, and to the master of time. The room caroused. Julian drank deep. The ale tasted like nectar. He felt the rush of success tingling in his fingertips. In that moment, and surrounded by the praise of these people, he felt as though he had already built the clock. He could see it finished in his mind's eye and ticking silently on the mantle of the royal palace. He felt the weight of the gold medal around his neck. He felt the pride of legacy. The satisfaction was total, and it was complete, and because he felt satisfied, the hunger died. 2 hours later, the rain began to fall, a cold and relentless sheet of water that turned the cobblestones of the city into slick, black mirrors. Julian stumbled out of the hollow barrel and buttoning his coat against the chill. The applause was still ringing in his ears, a comforting echo. He walked with a swagger, and his boots clicking rhythmically on the stones. He reached his workshop, a narrow, slanted building wedged between a bakery and a tannery, and he unlocked the heavy iron door and stepped inside. The smell hit him instantly, not garlic and all, but dust, cold metal, and stale oil. The air was frigid, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to gray ash hours ago. In the center of the room, covered by a dirty canvas tarp, sat the Chronos Aeterna. Julian lit a lantern, and the light swinging wildly and casting long, skeletal shadows against the walls filled with unused tools. He approached the workbench and pulled the tarp away, and there was no petrified oak. There were no fluid gear mechanisms. There was only a heap of scavenged brass wheels, a few cracked glass tubes, and in a frame made of cheap pine that he had assembled 3 months ago. He stared at it. The euphoria of the tavern evaporated, replaced by a crushing and nauseating weight in his gut. Tomorrow, he whispered to the empty room, I'll start the mercury alignment tomorrow. I just need to source the glass. It's tricky, and I need the right supplier. He was lying to himself, and deep down, in the place where the soul speaks without words, he knew it, and he had spent the last 3 hours describing the intricacies of the gear system to the barmaid, and expending all his creative energy on the performance of the idea rather than the execution of it. By talking about it, he had relieved the internal pressure that drives a man to create, and the anxiety of, "I must do this," had been soothed by the validation of, "You are amazing for thinking of this." He covered the mess back up with the tarp, and he couldn't bear to look at it. It was easier to go to sleep and dream of the finished product than to stand in the cold and file the brass gears until his fingers bled, and weeks turned into months. The pattern cemented itself into a ritual. By day, Julian would sleep late, avoiding the cold workshop. In the afternoons, he would sketch elaborate, impossible designs on napkins, feeling productive. By night, he would go to the hollow barrel or the gilded swan, and finding new ears to listen to his legend. He became a celebrity of potential. People pointed him out on the street. "That's Vane, the one building the Mercury clock," and he was famous for something he hadn't done. But the city of Tavern was not without its true masters. Across the river, and in the industrial district where the smog hung low and the buildings were stained with soot, lived a woman named Aeterna. Aeterna was a weaver, but to call her a weaver was like calling a hurricane a breeze. She worked with silk derived from a specific species of spider found only in the southern caves, and she wove tapestries that were said to trap the light within them, glowing softly in the dark. Aeterna never visited taverns. She had no friends in the city, and she spoke to no one about her work. One rainy Tuesday, Julian was forced to venture into the industrial district to buy oil for his lantern. He was hungover, and his head throbbing with the dull ache of too much praise and too little progress. As he passed a narrow alley, he saw a window glowing with an unearthly and iridescent blue light. Curiosity, the only honest instinct he had left, pulled him toward it. He peered through the grime-streaked glass. Inside, he saw Aeterna, and she was hunched over a massive loom, her fingers moving with a speed and violence that frightened him. She looked terrible. Her hair was matted, her skin was pale and gray, and there were dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. She was not smiling. She was not holding court. She was muttering to herself and a string of curses and calculations. She looked like she was in pain. But on the loom, Julian's breath fogged the glass, and the fabric she was weaving looked like liquid water suspended in air. It shimmered and rippled as she struck the threads. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he knocked on the door, compelled by a sudden, desperate need to be close to that kind of magic. Aeterna didn't answer. He knocked again, harder. Finally, the door creaked open. Aeterna stood there, smelling of sour sweat and Madai. She glared at him. "What?" I am Julian Vane," he stammered, adjusting his scarf and waiting for the recognition. "The clockmaker." She stared at him blankly. "What know you? What do you want?" "I saw your work through the window," Julian said, his voice dropping. "It's magnificent. The way you've captured the light, I must ask, how did you achieve the tension in the warp threads? And I've been theorizing about tension in my own work with Mercury and—" "Go away," Aeterna said, moving to close the door. "What?" Julian jammed his boot in the doorframe. "I just want to talk shop. I'm an artist like you. We should exchange ideas. I can tell you about the Chronos Aeterna. It's going to change the world, and I've figured out how to make time fluid, you see." Aeterna looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. It was a look that cut deeper than any insult. "You talk a lot," she said softly. "Communication is the essence of art," Julian countered defensively. "No," Aeterna replied, her voice raspy from disuse. "Silence is the essence of art. Energy is finite, clockmaker. You pour yours out of your mouth. I pour mine into my hands. If I told you how I make the silk glow, I would lose the magic of finding out if I can actually do it. Now, move your foot or I will break it." She slammed the door. The lock clicked, and Julian stood alone in the alley, the rain soaking through his expensive coat. He felt small. He felt angry. Who was she to dismiss him? He was the visionary, and he had the ideas. But as he walked back toward the bridge that separated the working district from the tavern district, a terrifying thought rooted in his mind. And she had the silk. He only had the story. He returned to the hollow barrel that night, determined to drown the memory of the weaver in noise and adoration. And the crowd was there, waiting. "Julian," cried the innkeeper, "tell us again about the petrified oak. Old Miller here doesn't believe wood can sing." Julian opened his mouth to launch into his rehearsed speech. the one about the acoustic properties of ancient timber. But as he looked at their eager, slightly drunk faces, and the words turned to ash in his throat, he saw them clearly for the first time. They didn't care about the clock. They didn't care about the art. They were bored, and he was their entertainment. He was the court jester, dancing for their amusement, paying for his supper with pieces of his soul. He felt a sudden panic, and he realized he couldn't remember the exact measurements he had written down months ago for the main gear. Had it been 12 centimeters or 14? And Julian. The barmaid touched his arm. Are you all right? Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I have to go. But you haven't finished the story, someone shouted. The story is killing the ending. Julian snapped, surprising even himself. He ran out of the tavern, and leaving his half-finished ale on the table, he ran through the rain, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He needed to work, and he needed to prove the weaver wrong. He needed to prove himself wrong. He burst into his workshop, soaking wet, and tore the tarp off the pathetic frame of the Chronos Aeterna. He grabbed a file and a piece of raw brass. He sat down at the bench. His hands were shaking. And just work? He hissed through gritted teeth. Just do one thing. But his hands felt clumsy, soft. They were the hands of a talker, not a maker. And he tried to file the brass into a perfect circle. But the metal fought him. It screeched and slipped. He didn't have the calluses. He didn't have the muscle memory. And worse, the silence of the room was deafening. There was no applause here. There was no one telling him he was a genius. There was only the cold, hard, and indifferent reality of the material. The brass didn't care about his vision. The wood didn't care about his reputation. He worked for 10 minutes, and sweating despite the cold. The gear was lopsided. It was ugly. Frustration bubbled up in his chest, hot and acidic. It was so much harder than describing it. It was boring, and it was tedious. It hurt. Why was he doing this? He could go back to the tavern right now. He could walk in, order a whiskey, and tell them that he had a breakthrough, and that the clock was nearly done. They would cheer. He would feel great. He dropped the file, and the metal clattered against the floor. He looked at the door. The siren call of validation was pulling him, and a magnetic force dragging him away from the difficulty of the work. He stood up. He took a step toward the door. Then he stopped, and he looked at his reflection in the dark windowpane. He saw a ghost, a man made of words. If he left now, the clock would never exist. He would be Julian Vane, and the man who almost built the greatest timepiece in history. He would die, and his legacy would be a collection of drunken stories told by people who didn't truly know him, but the pain of staying was unbearable. The withdrawal from the dopamine of praise was physical. He was trembling. He looked at the lopsided gear, and, I don't know how to do this. He whispered, the tears finally coming, hot and stinging. I talked it all away. Julian did not return to the tavern that night, and nor the next. He locked the heavy iron door of his workshop from the inside, a symbolic act of imprisoning himself with his own failure, and the first week was a special kind of hell. It was a detoxification process. His mind, starved of the easy dopamine of applause, screamed for release, and he found himself pacing the small room, having imaginary arguments with the weaver Aeterna, crafting brilliant retorts to her insults that he would never deliver. And he would pick up a tool, work for 10 minutes, become overwhelmed by the tediousness of sanding wood or calibrating a spring, and throw the tool across the room in a fit of rage. The silence was a vacuum that sucked at his sanity. He craved the noise, the toasts, and the validation that he was somebody. I am the architect of time. He would mutter to the cold stones, but the words sounded hollow, like coins dropped in an empty well, and he was not an architect. He was a frightened man in a cold room with a pile of expensive junk. Eventually, the rage burned itself out, leaving behind a dull and aching humility. He looked at the lopsided gear he had made on that first night. It was pathetic, but it was real. It existed outside of his head, and he picked up the file again. He began to learn the language of silence. He learned that brass has a grain that must be respected, and that glass is temperamental and cracks if rushed, and that mercury is a poisonous ductress that demands absolute steadiness of hand. He stopped sleeping till noon, and he woke before dawn, driven not by inspiration, but by a terrifying anxiety that he was running out of time. His hands, once soft and stained only with ink, became calloused, cut, and permanently etched with grease. His back ached constantly. He lost weight. The handsome, scarf-draped artist was replaced by a gaunt and dirty laborer. He didn't visit Alara again, but her image became his muse, not a romantic muse, but a harsh taskmaster. And, whenever he felt the urge to leave the workshop and find someone to brag to about a small success, he would picture her face, that look of profound pity. "You talk a lot." And the memory was a whip that drove him back to the bench. Months bled into seasons. Winter hardened the ground, and, making the workshop so cold his breath plumed in front of his face, but he kept working, wrapping rags around his hands to keep them from going numb. And then came the night of the alignment. The clock's frame was finished, constructed not of mythical petrified oak, but of good and honest walnut that he had painstakingly seasoned himself. The gears were fitted. Now came the impossible part, and introducing the mercury into the vacuum-sealed glass tubing that would serve as the clock's regulating pendulum. It was past midnight. The city outside was asleep, and Julian's hands shook slightly as he held the beaker of heavy, silver liquid. One wrong move, one air bubble, and the entire mechanism would be ruined, and the pressure shattered. He began to pour. The mercury flowed like molten mirror, thick and deadly. Suddenly, a tremor ran through his exhausted arm, and the beaker clinked against the glass intake tube. Ack! A spiderweb fracture appeared on the delicate glass casing. Julian froze. His heart hammered against his ribs, and months of work hung in the balance. The old Julian would have panicked. He would have run out of the shop, found the nearest night watchman, and then dramatically recounted the tragedy of the broken glass, seeking comfort in the story of his disaster. The new Julian did not move. He did not speak. He did not breathe, and in the crushing silence, he assessed the damage. The fracture was small. If he acted instantly, he could seal it before the vacuum was lost. He slowly set down the beaker, and he grabbed a stick of sealing wax and his spirit lamp. With a surgeon's precision, fighting the adrenaline coursing through his veins, he melted the wax over the fracture, and he held it there, his own body serving as a vise, until the wax cooled and hardened. He waited. He watched the mercury level. It held steady. He had saved it, and nobody applauded. There was no one there to witness his triumph over disaster, and in that moment, Julian realized something profound. The satisfaction he felt right now, and cold, sweaty, terrifying, and solitary, was infinitely more powerful than any cheer in a tavern. This victory was his alone. It was real. 3 weeks later, and the Chronos Aeterna was finished. It was not the towering, mythical machine he had described in his drunken tales. It was smaller, denser. The wood was darker, and scarred in places where he had made mistakes and had to correct them. But it was alive. The mercury flowed in a hypnotic, silent rhythm, and rising and falling with an unseen tide. The gears turned with a smoothness that defied friction, and it emitted a sound, not a hum, but a low and resonant vibration that you felt in your chest more than you heard. It was the sound of deep time, slow and relentless. Julian didn't take it to the hollow barrel, and he sent a single, handwritten letter to the Royal Guild of Horologists, inviting the master and 2 senior members to his workshop. They arrived on a rainy afternoon, and skeptical men in gray coats who had heard the rumors of the loudmouth pretender. They stepped into the workshop. Julian said nothing, and he simply gestured to the corner where the clock stood, ticking its silent, liquid time. The 3 men approached it. They stood before it for a long time, and the minutes ticked by. The mercury rose imperceptibly. The master horologist, a man known for his harsh critiques, leaned in close, examining the glasswork, and he traced the grain of the walnut with a trembling finger. Finally, he turned to Julian. The look in his eyes was not the glazed adoration of the barmaid, and it was something sharper, colder, and infinitely more valuable: respect. The compensation for the atmospheric pressure. The master whispered, and his voice thick with emotion. "How did you achieve the seal?" Julian opened his mouth to launch into a grand explanation and to tell the story of the cracked glass and his heroic fix. He stopped. He thought of Alara. He thought of the long, cold nights. "It was difficult," Julian said simply, "and it required patience." The master nodded slowly. "It is a masterpiece, Mr. Vane. It is the finest instrument I have seen in 50 years. They left an hour later, and promising commissions and a formal presentation at the palace. Julian closed the door behind them. He was alone again with his creation. He was exhausted, his body broken, and his hands scarred. He had never felt so quiet inside. He realized that the validation he had chased in the taverns was candy, and a quick sugar rush that left you rotting from the inside out. This feeling, this quiet knowledge of what he had endured and what he had built, was sustenance, and it was bread and meat for the soul. You must protect your dreams from the premature harvest of applause. When you speak your intentions, and you dissipate the energy needed to manifest them. You trade the gold of creation for the copper of attention. Build in the dark. Struggle in silence, and let the work be the noise. And when it is finished, when it stands undeniable in the light of reality, you won't need to tell anyone what it is. They will already know. And if this story resonated with the silent worker in you, subscribe to Mindset Millionaire for more tales of truth and transformation.